Welcome to episode 151. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. It's time for this week's weekly update. Joining me for this week's weekly update is the Manager of Workplace Relations Services and aspiring slam poet, Tim Nagle. Welcome, Tim.
Good to be here, Stuart.
Tim, it feels like it's a while since we've done this.
It has been a while, I think.
Would you be good enough to reveal the clue for today's discussion? And for the benefit of those people who are listening to this podcast rather than watching, could you describe the objects?
So we've got two things. We've got an old iron and a picture of two Spider-Men pointing at each other. So
I'm reliably informed that this is a well-known internet meme, which is taken from a Spider-Man cartoon in 1967 and an episode called Double Identity, for reasons that are probably overwhelmingly apparent. And in the episode, apparently one of the villains attempts to impersonate Spider-Man. So based on that clue as well as the iron, what would you say that the subject for today's discussion is?
Well, it's clearly uniform and laundry allowances.
I can see how you got there, but you're completely wrong. Tim, in terms of the iron, today what we hope to do is iron out some misunderstandings with regards to a particular set of government policies that apply to IR. And in terms of the focus that we're going to have on those IR policies, you can see that there are two Spider-Men and plainly that is one Spider-Man too many, one of whom I suspect will have to be made redundant. So today we're going to be talking about the 2015 Public Sector Industrial Relations policies that apply to public health services, particularly as they relate to redundancy and their interaction with enterprise agreements. But for those who are unfamiliar with the policies, could you provide some context?
So the IR Policy 2015 was introduced by the Victorian Government and outlines the government's policy on various public sector industrial relations matters, which include the following. So various standards, requirements and guidelines to foster a productive industrial relations culture, and finally the achievement of high performance, effective and constructive workplace partnerships.
So fun fact, Tim, the 2015 IR public sector policies were released, of course, in 2016.
Yes.
But whilst those things are relevant to members, today we're going to focus on the interaction of the policy with enterprise agreements, particularly as it pertains to redundancy. So let's start at the start. How do the IR policies apply to VHIA members?
Yeah, so at page 3 it states that the policies apply to all departments and public sector bodies of the state of Victoria and their non-executive level employees, as defined under the Public Administration Act 2004 in Victoria. It specifically states, for the avoidance of doubt, the policies apply to all public health services, schools and standalone TAFE institutions.
Now that's very unambiguous and clear, but just in case you needed something more, there's a further reference to hospitals?
There is indeed. At page 12 it states that the provision in the document apply to the redundancy termination process in Victorian public sector agencies.
Okay, so let's address community health.
So they're not expressly included. But there are two things for community health to be mindful of. So the first one is whether the relevant enterprise agreement expressly relies on the policy.
And an example of that would be the nurses agreement, which expressly relies on those IR policies.
Correct. If you are going through a redundancy process, it is useful for community health centres to be aware of the IR policies, because employee representatives such as unions are likely to be influenced by those IR policies.
Within the coverage of those policies, are there categories or groups who are excluded?
So there are some exclusions, and those are as follows. Firstly, executives, and secondly, casual and temporary employees and fixed-term contract employees.
So from memory, the IR policy of 2015 still states that specific consideration may be given to individual cases involving fixed-term or long-term casual employees or employees who've been engaged on successive fixed-term contracts.
Correct.
And what's the connection between the IR policies and enterprise agreements?
Yeah, so most agreements now contain terms about redundancy and outline an employer's obligation and an employer's entitlements upon termination of employment as a result of redundancy. So it's a topic dealt with by the enterprise agreements often.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. So clause 12.7 of the Nurses and Midwives Agreement outlines the following. The Victorian Government's policy with respect to public sector redundancy and the entitlements upon termination of employment as a result of redundancy are set out in the Public Sector Workplace Relations Policies 2015. The policy, as at the time this agreement comes to operation, applies to employees but does not form part of the agreement.
So that is quite a common provision. I wouldn't say it appears in every single agreement, but it does appear in many. Could you explain the expression that says the policy is applicable to employees upon the operation of the agreement but does not form part of the agreement? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So it applies in its own right rather than as a term of the agreement. Also, the policy isn't frozen in time, so if it changes, the obligation changes.
So if the IR policy from 2015 is varied or replaced, then the amended document will apply?
Correct.
And do all public sector agreements contain the same provision regarding redundancy terms in the same way that the nurses does?
No, not quite. There are some subtle differences in the different agreements, but the public sector agreements we manage all contain a provision referring to redundancy entitlements within the government's IR policy.
So in that table that's currently on screen, I can see that the Victorian Public Health Sector Maintenance Multi-Employer Agreement contains a differently worded clause regarding redundancy. All of the other agreements refer to the 2015 policy, but the maintenance agreement refers explicitly to the 2012 policy.
Yeah, so we'll discuss the differences and similarities between the IR policy 2012 and the 2015 policy a little later. However, we note the language in clause 21 of the maintenance agreement regarding redundancy entitlements. Although clause 21 outlines or refers to the IR policy 2012, when it comes to public sector redundancy, it also states as varied from time to time, so it just needs an update of that language.
It really takes us back then to the 2015 set of policies, and yes, I think updating the language will be on our list of things to do. Leaving the policies to one side for a moment, just to refresh people's memories, the issue of incorporating documents that may change, can that occur?
So it can. Section 257 of the Fair Work Act 2009 outlines that enterprise agreements may incorporate material in force at a particular time or from time to time.
So heading back to the IR policy of 2015, what does it say about the end of employment and redundancy?
So broadly it outlines two types of separation packages, namely a voluntary departure package or a VDP, or secondly a targeted separation package or a TSP.
So the obvious question there is, what is the difference between a VDP and a TSP?
So the VDP would be offered in circumstances where larger scale structural change or employee reductions are required.
And I'm struck by the term voluntary. In that context, are there post-employment restrictions that apply?
So there's a 3-year restriction on re-employment within the Victorian public sector. So recipients of a VDP are required to agree not to seek or accept re-employment with or fee for service from a public sector employer, including public sector employment through a labour hire agency, for a minimum of 3 calendar years from the date of their separation.
Are there any exceptions to that requirement?
There are. Extraordinary circumstances would be an exception. So an agency head may approve earlier re-employment, but there must be no undertaking to this effect prior to an employee's departure as a VDP recipient.
And I understand that employers need to seek approval from the ATO before conducting a VDP program.
Yeah, that's right.
So how is a VDP offered and considered by employees?
So employees are not compelled to accept offers and may withdraw an expression of interest at any time prior to accepting an offer, hence voluntary and voluntary departure package title. Also, employers are not bound to accept any employee's expression of interest in a VDP or to offer any particular employee a VDP.
So tell me about targeted separation packages.
A TSP is a compulsory retrenchment package and action of last resort. So departments and agencies must exhaust redeployment opportunities before applying a TSP.
So I think that's an important point to emphasise, that redeployment must be exhausted before you begin to look at a TSP.
Yeah, that's correct. So TSPs are not voluntary and there is no requirement for prior approval from the ATO as long as it can be established that the separation was a bona fide redundancy.
And in what circumstances will a redundancy be a bona fide redundancy?
So TSPs are applied in circumstances where the work is not required to be performed by the employer or be performed by anyone and where there is no opportunity for continued employment of the employee.
Bearing in mind that employers would have to adhere to the requirements of a relevant enterprise agreement in terms of matters like consultation, support and potential redeployment before arriving at that destination of redundancy.
Oh, definitely. And those obligations are further supported in the enterprise agreements themselves. So further decisions on which particular roles are declared excess or surplus must be made on objective, non-discriminatory criteria that are consistently applied.
And so how are VDPs and TSPs calculated?
So a VDP is comprised of the following three elements. Firstly, 4 weeks pay irrespective of the employee's length of service. A lump sum voluntary departure incentive of up to $10,000 for a full-time employee. And finally, 2 weeks pay per each completed year of continuous service up to a maximum of 15 years. That's the VDP. A TSP is comprised of the following elements. 1, 4 weeks of pay irrespective of the employee's length of service. 1 additional week's pay if the employee is over 45 years of age and has completed at least 2 years of continuous service. And finally, 2 weeks pay per each completed year of continuous service up to a maximum of 10 years.
So let's discuss the first element of each of those, which is that reference to 4 weeks of pay. And in the case of a VDP, it's described as 4 weeks of pay, irrespective of the employee's length of service. It sounds like it should be notice, but it doesn't describe itself as notice. How does that 4-week payment, both in the context of a VDP and a TSP, how does it interact with the giving of notice?
So it doesn't. The IR policy of 2015 states that departments and agencies must provide notice of termination or payment in lieu of notice in addition to the relevant package. That is, giving notice or payment in lieu is in addition to this 4-week payment and other elements of a departure package.
Was it always that way?
The previous version of the policy in 2012 described this 4-week payment as notice. But in spite of this, the 2012 policy said for a VDP it was payable regardless of the notice actually given.
So under the previous policy in 2012, an employee would likely have received both a payment that was expressed to be in lieu of notice as well as notice?
Correct. For a TSP, it stated the 4-week payment was payable on cessation of employment.
Which again suggests that you're likely to receive it irrespective of receiving the actual notice.
That's correct. Not as clear as the current policy, but probably to the same effect.
So the key message there in terms of calculations is not to mistake the 4-week payment with notice. That it's paid in addition to notice or payment in lieu of notice.
Correct.
Tim, thank you for taking us through the 2015 IR policies with that focus on redundancy.
My pleasure.
VHIA.com.